Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar presented by LinkSquares and BreachRx. Not only is it Halloween today, but we're actually wrapping up Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we felt it fitting to touch upon kind of a spooky topic that affects all of us, cybersecurity. We're going to be presenting tips, tricks throughout the presentation as it relates to cybersecurity, contract management, and incident management. And also stay tuned at the end for Q&A. Just drop any questions into that questions box right in your control panel, and we will answer them at the end if we have time. I'm going to kick it off to Andy and Heather now to take you through the remainder of the presentation.
Absolutely. So my name is Heather Sukis. I'm a technical solutions attorney here at LinkSquares. LinkSquares is an AI-powered end-to-end contract lifecycle management solution. We aim to streamline and reduce risk in the drafting process. We then implement an e-signature tool. We have our own LinkSquares Sign, and then we centralize your fully executed agreements into a clean and easy to navigate repository that pulls all of your relevant contract terms. At LinkSquares, we involve legal engineers in the sales process, and this is to bring our practice experience and to help prospects evaluate the tool, as a lot of the pain points that our customers experience are ones that I'm very familiar with. It's definitely a very interesting role, and I definitely enjoy helping companies to solve their issues with our innovative and high quality products.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Lunsford, CEO and founder of BreachRx. I'm an attorney by background. I've spent about almost 20 years now in the privacy cybersecurity space. I started on some of the first data breach litigation in the early 2000s, and then did a whole lot of commercial litigation prior to founding BreachRx. So our mission at BreachRx is to help companies be more proactively prepared to respond to and recover from data breaches. Our automation platform it allows you to automate a lot of the compliance activities you need to take care of whenever a breach happens. So you can really make it more of a routine business process and less of a crisis.
Awesome. And so as for the agenda for today, this is just a quick overview of what you can expect. So we'll move through different topics and leave time at the end for Q&A. The entire webinar will be roughly about 45 minutes. And if you found this webinar, then you're likely interested in how you can improve your overall security posture for yourself and for your organization as a whole. So let's dive in.
Yeah, so starting off here, statistics. I'm sure everybody here on the webinar is aware, if you just pay even a little bit of attention to the news, that data breaches incidents continue to increase every single year. And I actually saw this really kind of shocking statistic just the other day in my news feed that data breaches are up 70% in this quarter, or in Q3 over Q2. And I think part of this is that we saw a little bit of a down in Q2 because of all the Russia and Ukraine stuff, and that's kind of a central place where a lot of hacking comes from. And I guess maybe the distraction isn't quite as high as it was before, and now it's ticked back up. But yeah, the cost of a data breach also continues to go up. Ponemon does an annual study every year, and in the last year, they said 4.24 million was the average cost of a data breach. And one thing to note here is these are all breaches that are under 100,000 records. So those are not the kind of mega breach you read about in the news, but really much more minor one. So here are just a few more interesting statistics I think that are worth noting. First of all, this first one, 83% of companies experiencing more than one data breach. I think it's often this myth that you're only going to have a once in a lifetime situation where you'd have a breach and hopefully it would never happen to you. The reality is that every company is dealing with breaches, and they're all dealing with them in a multitude. And so that's something to keep in mind. Already talked about this first one. Maybe another thing to note is 4.35 is the global average. In the US, it's closer to 9.5 million. In the latest study. Another big piece here is this third bullet, and if any of you all have been following the story on Uber and the Joe Sullivan CISO case, basically we're seeing more and more that leaders of organizations are getting held personally accountable. So in the Uber case, without going too far into the details, basically he was convicted criminally for failing to notify properly about a breach. There's a lot of allegations of whether it was cover up or not, but suffice to say, it is something that's changed, that now you have leaders being held personally accountable. We also saw this happen recently in this case with Drizzly. For any of you folks that are local to the Boston area know of them, and then also just kind of seeing this happen more and more in the international regs that are coming out, that there's a personal liability component to it. And so this last big piece is really an easy takeaway, I think, from this presentation. If you get one thing, is that if you run exercises and practice your incident response program, you can see massive savings when it comes to having a breach and what it costs your organization to go through it. And it doesn't have to be the $40,000-$50,000 exercise that you pay an outside consulting firm or a law firm to do. If you have a solution like BreachRx, you can actually do these kind of things self-sufficiently and run these tabletops on your own in any kind of large scale or smaller scale that you'd like.
Absolutely. We hear about these kinds of things all the time, and it's recommended that businesses review contractual relationships with their service providers, as major supply chain attacks can expose hundreds of companies, dozens of federal agencies, millions of individuals, and an untold number of state secrets and illegal surveillance and theft. One of your best defenses against similar cyber attacks is contract management.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that it's often it's easy to look at all the regulations that are out there and the short deadlines that are around those, but a lot of people don't realize that all the contracts you have tend to have data breach obligations within them, and they're usually even shorter than what the regulations require. And that's why a lot of times, especially in the mega breach situation, you'll see these big companies will have hundreds of lawsuits filed within the first week or two of an incident. So yeah, I think here on this slide, we're just going to talk through some of the different types of incidents we see a lot of companies having. And the point really here is that these are all can be very minor things. They're not, it doesn't have to be, again, like the catastrophic. You can have something as simple as a phishing attack, which is where somebody sent you emails with links that entice your employees to click on them, and that can be enough to start the infiltration for an adversary. Misdirected emails is not even really a cybersecurity attack, but it's just a mistake. Sometimes you have customer information in emails, you send it to the wrong person, and that is an exposure of information to that other party, which can be a privacy incident that would require contractual obligations, can require regulatory obligations. It doesn't seem as headline inducing, but it still can require a lot of work for companies that are dealing with it. The corporate account takeover, the kind of classic example people talk about here, is where an adversary uses credentials of an employee to do all kinds of different things, either within the company or in probably the most common is seeing them take over and go into a bank account and start transferring money to different places. And again, that can be started from something like a phishing attack or just loose security standards within a company. Malware is more of, like, I think more traditional, like old school, that people talk about more, is where actually your devices become infected with code that is destructive to those devices, or they allow more access to the adversary. Ransomware, I think that gets the most headlines, hearing company held ransom or paying a ransom. One thing that maybe is less understood or known from a lot of more of consumers today is that ransomware is not just individual hackers going after individual companies. There's actually criminal organizations that are doing ransomware as a service. So they'll actually offer a product, a SaaS product for other people that don't really have a ton of technical sophistication, can implement and deploy. And so that's why we really see this kind of explosion of ransomware cases that have made a lot of news headlines.
And we're definitely seeing the case from the SaaS side, the good SaaS side, that as these threats and cybersecurity teams multiply, they just have more responsibilities and less time. In addition, legislation is increasing cybersecurity and privacy responsibilities and reporting. And so it really reduces your breach notification window as well. So compliance framework and criteria are becoming more burdensome and time consuming. Incident response time to this must essentially just evolve. Companies are using CLM to transform their incident and data breach response processes to be more efficient, dynamic, and provide an alternative to the traditional manual status quo.
Definitely. Yeah, so here are some core questions that, and I won't read them all one by one, but just things to be thinking about that when you think about what do you need to do at your organization, what are the things that are going to most practically help you be prepared. So, one is what is your risk profile? What are you willing to tolerate? But it's important to kind of a starting point. What is the data your company holds? What is it? Personal information? Is it healthcare information? Is it just sensitive information from other companies? And knowing that that is often your biggest risk is what is going to happen if your data is exposed, and what does that mean from a regulatory perspective. So when you look at the data breach regulations kind of differently than other regulations and other aspects of the law, in this case it's not where your business is necessarily located, it's where all your customers located. So if you have customers in all 50 states and different countries, you're going to be subject to all of these regulations. So like Heather mentioned a minute ago, there's 180 plus cybersecurity and privacy regulations across the world. And being able to have a handle on them, it's important to know, okay, where are all our customers located? Other things you can do that I think are important for helping your company be more proactively prepared is really identifying members on your team. So if you're a smaller team, may not be people with their primary responsibility, but you need to find people that are going to be the cybersecurity champions and the privacy champions within your organization, and they can help spread beyond just the legal team of really making sure people care about this and understand that there are real ramifications for the company and for people personally, unfortunately, when things happen. Another big piece here that's important is, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, is like it really is important that you get a grasp on what your obligations are in your contracts for data breach obligations. So we have 180 plus data breach regulations across the world, but your contract, and a lot of those have short timelines, like GDPR is the most well-known, has a 72-hour reporting deadline. There's even shorter ones in other places. India has this crazy 6-hour deadline. But a lot of times your contracts will actually be even shorter because those same contract parties have these regulations to adhere to too. So they'll make the deadline for the contract even shorter than what you get for the regulation. So not having a handle on that is tough. And then I think one of the other pieces here is it's more and more understood that you need to have some kind of cyber insurance in place to help you mitigate some of this risk. But it's also worth knowing that if anyone that's procured recently, the cost of insurance continues to go up pretty significantly, and the amount of things they're covering is actually dropping. And so one of the things we do at BreachRx as part of an onboarding with our customers is that we go through their cyber insurance policy in great detail and make sure that their incident response program is designed to meet all the requirements of insurance so that they can get the maximum amount of coverage when anything does happen. But what we're seeing is this trend that more and more things are excluded, and specifically, a more alarming one recently is that we're seeing that the actual contract disputes around data breaches are getting excluded. So it's one thing if the insurance will just cover, okay, here's the initial notifications we need to do, but the reality is if you have hundreds or thousands of contracts, that's a pretty massive liability that's not covered if you're going to have lawsuits that happen afterwards.
One important component also as you're considering your risk and protection profile is that although your cybersecurity may be adequate, you also have to think of that of your suppliers. And that's why it's important to look into review what kind of security measures, not only yourself, but your vendors are contractually obligated to provide.
Yeah, absolutely. A supply chain is a big risk. Third-party risk is what people say is often the biggest risk for a business.
All right, so I think this is a great time to talk about one piece of the product at LinkSquares Analyze that really helps with this is something that we like to call smart values. So let me come over here. So smart values are words, clauses, phrases, and dates that are really particular to commercial and legal analysis of your documents. So let's see, we can track here in LinkSquares Analyze. Oh, there we go. In LinkSquares Analyze, we can track over 100 smart values, more than 20 of which are directly or indirectly related to the security and data accountability that your vendor and you must provide as an organization. So 3 of the most important of these, you'll see right here, we have our data security clause that we pull. And the data security clause typically contains most of the contract stipulations that CISA recommends. We also have data security and audit certification. And so this clause is kind of a trust but verify check mark on the data security clause. And it'll spell out often and what an outside party verifies as a vendor's promised security measures, as well as how you can request copies of these attestations. And then we also have, you'll see all these different data security stipulations that are a little bit more particular. We also have the general data breach clause, which includes exactly what the vendor is required to do in the wake of a successful cybersecurity attack. And that's kind of one way you can get a handle on these things, aside from just manually combing through all of your contracts. Our system will allow you to report on these and pull them on an individual contract to contract basis.
That's really, really helpful. Like right here, seeing this data breach notify immediately as a clause and being able to pull that out right away. I've worked with many of our customers when you have to review hundreds of thousands of contracts, and these are not uniform. Like you may have 24 hours on one, immediately on another, and so being able to quickly get a sense of that is, you know, massive time savings. That you don't really want to be doing that live when an incident happens, because that is just a massive, massive effort. And if you have only 24 hours to respond, you might not actually be able to physically review all your contracts fast enough to meet those deadlines.
Definitely. We hear often that a lot of companies don't really have a handle on things, unfortunately, until something kind of happens. And then on the alternative, you know, they engage in this extremely manual process. And as you continue to scale, this really just becomes impossible. So it's really preferable to have an actionable plan in place.
So you know, kind of taking from having that contract input, you know, that's one of the sort of different feeds that feed into the things you need to be doing when you respond to an incident. So when you think about it, the big pieces are, you know, starting with your cyber insurance policy, because you often have to let them know before you know anybody else. Some people joke and they call it it's like an HMO. You have to ask for permission for every dollar you're going to spend on an incident. So knowing those requirements, knowing what your contractual obligations are across, you know, as you said, both your people you owe notice to, or any kind of people that are your vendors that are going to owe notice to you, is really important to have a handle on. And then obviously the regulations too. And so having an incident management tool like BreachRx can help you keep all that organized. And so you know exactly, you know, when an incident happens, these are the people I have to notify. This is the order I need to go through and accomplish that. Another big important piece to think about when you're looking at being prepared for this, and this will come out, I think, a lot when you do these tabletops that we talked about earlier in the presentation, is that you know, being very conscious about how you're going to handle attorney-client privilege. So we've unfortunately had a whole slew of court cases that are making this harder on companies to protect some of those sensitive communications you have when an incident occurs, and often it's because the facts get interspersed with the privileged information. And so courts have basically said, you know, if you're doing this work in the place that you're all that is merged together, you can unfortunately have to turn over everything, the privileged material too. And so it's important to have a way of bifurcating that activity and saying, okay, here is the factual information, because you will have to provide facts about what happened around an incident. You need to be able to prove, hey, we took the right actions at the right time. But you also, you know, want to protect yourself and have those sensitive communications in another area. And so trying to do that over, you know, Slack or Teams or you know, doing it in any other kind of like ticketing tool can really be problematic when it comes to actually protecting that when you get to litigation. And so that's just an important piece you should keep in mind as you think about how you proactively prepare, and then again, you know, practice, you know, at least once a year if you can. If you can do more, you know, on a quarterly basis, that's even better. But that's what we're kind of seeing as the best practices. So yeah, here's just a few other things to keep in mind. You know, this month is really great for cybersecurity awareness. Anybody that's on LinkedIn hopefully has seen lots of messages about cybersecurity, things your organization can be doing. Multi-factor authentication is a big deal on that. I know that a lot of times people don't have it enabled on accounts, and it's a really simple thing to turn on that can really protect you in a lot of ways. Knowing where your critical data assets are located, making sure they're protected, and if you have a sense of these data sets are the highest risk, then you can kind of protect those crown jewels in maybe more elaborate ways than some of the data that's less risky for you. And again, having a very well organized plan for handling incidents and having a way to do it in an actionable way. So, the standard advice you see out there is like, hey, have an incident response plan, and it is a good starting point, but it's really important that you make those actionable. And so not just, hey, here are the 4 or 5 people that are on our team, here's some vendors we're going to call, but like, hey, how are we going to actually evaluate these decisions, and do we have a sense of what are all our contractual obligations, what are all the regulatory obligations going to be, and how do we quickly make those calls when you've got hours to make that decision. And so I think being able to leverage tools like BreachRx and LinkSquares can really help with that. But most important is that you really have spent some time to think about it, and you've worked with your entire team to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Absolutely. I mean, we always hear about all of these, kind of make-believe holidays, but Cybersecurity Awareness Month is really an important prompt just to kind of do a self-check, a mental check, as well as across your team, and just implement these different trainings and actions, and consider what your response would be in the event that something did occur.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think we're ready for questions. If Maria, if you had any come through.
Yes, hello. Thank you both. We had quite a few questions come through, actually. One question, are screenshots enforceable? So for example, a screenshot of Salesforce activity, is that still Salesforce, or is that not enforceable for a data breach? Like how does a screenshot play into kind of handling all of this?
So maybe just make sure I'm understanding the question. So if a screenshot were of personal information from Salesforce were exposed to someone else, would that be equivalent of like if somebody had broken into Salesforce and seen it? Is that kind of where
Correct.
it's going?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I would say, unfortunately, yes. Like it's wherever the date, it's all about, is that personal information in that screenshot? So if it's the same, if it's got names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, any kind of personal account information. Sometimes in some of these regulations, it can just be as simple as like your account and password is considered personal information, but in some of these statutes. And then as LinkSquare's team is very familiar, there's also all the contracts. So it could be that you've shared information with one of your customers giving you information about them. It's in your Salesforce account, and you've have a contract with them, and it may be any of the information that's relevant to that company could be considered information that might trigger breach notification obligations.
Great, thank you. And how can I ensure that my team is operating at max efficiency when responding to data incidents? I know we talked about best practices, but it sounds like this question is more about how do you ensure that it's max efficiency?
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, have a solution like BreachRx in place where you're actually able to track everybody in the same place. I think that's important. It's also really helpful to have like this be a separate place to communicate that's not where regular business activities happen, again from a privilege perspective, but also when you're thinking about efficiency and making sure everybody's on top of the tasks that are in front of you. I think having an agreed upon place, whether that's BreachRx or it's another communication venue that is an out of band place to do that work, I think is important. But it's also a system that has key responsibilities and deadlines that are assigned to specific people, and not just, hey, these are the general things we need to get done, but like, hey, this is got to be done by this time, and this is the person, or these are the people that are responsible for getting it done. I think trying to, it's another reason why the exercises can be so valuable. It's, I think, sometimes people get into responding to an incident and they haven't done a lot of the like thinking ahead of like who's going to be responsible for what. And so, one, a lot of people are reluctant to raise their hand to say, hey, I'll take that on. Or, you have to like start having somebody that has sort of incident leader role that can say, okay, you're doing this, you're doing this, and you're doing that. And who's going to make what kind of decisions, because there are a lot of risk-based decisions you got to make when you're going through that. So again, I think doing exercises, and again, it doesn't have to be the $40,000, $50,000 outside law firm, consulting firm. Like, you can do some of this stuff self-sufficiently, and we'd love to help you if you're interested.
Awesome.
Absolutely. I mean, there are obviously companies like BreachRx and like LinkSquares, because the first component of this is just knowing what your obligations are, and then second, being able to enforce them. At LinkSquares, we have a team that's specifically designated with providing the gold standard of security for our customers' documents as well as our own, and that's regularly enforced with both employee training as well as with our customers as far as best practices with storing and implementing our tool.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some key performance indicators we can use to measure the progress of managing an incident?
Yeah, great question. So the progress of managing itself, there's some key performance indicators, I'd say, even just about when it comes to preparing for incidents. So like, what percentage of your contracts have you been able to extract and understand all of your obligations? What, from a regulatory perspective, how many regulations are covered in your plan versus not? But when you're actually tracking within an incident, a lot of it is time to complete certain things. So like, what was the from a security perspective, it's always like how long it was the time before we discovered it from when it happened, if it's with the breach, and then it's once you knew that information, how long did it take you to respond in the proper way? Sometimes that involves an amount of forensics that has to be done. And then, obviously tracking what all these deadlines are that you have to notify your contract partners, notify the regulators, to know your cyber insurance, and like where are you in metrics from a timeliness perspective. So those are key, I think, while you're going through it. There's also, just as time goes on, and as we kind of said at the beginning, companies are going to have multiple incidents, and so tracking trends over time and seeing, okay, what are the incidents we had this quarter versus last, or this year versus last. Have we taken the remediation steps? Because another piece when you finish an incident is you always need to do the lessons learned, looking back and say, okay, how do we prevent this incident from happening again, or how do we make it less likely that it would happen again? So tracking how well are we following all of those lessons learned and those remediation steps, because unfortunately you see a lot of times somebody gets through an incident and it's just house is on fire, doing everything you can to deal with the situation at hand, and either there is no reflection on what would have stopped this from happening before, but if there is, the actual like following and tasking that, again, like an incident management platform like BreachRx can help you track some of those after action activities and make sure you're doing it. And it's also something when you look at what the regulators, or if you're getting like SOC 2 or ISO certification, they want to see that you have put remediation steps down after you have an incident, and that you've actually followed through with that, because you can lose your certification or get dinged by a regulator by not having reasonable security in place if you're not being responsible about following up on those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know several people that we work with at LinkSquares have small legal teams. So a question actually came in about someone with a small legal team. Like, where do you start to build a privacy program when it might be just one person or a very small team? I know you mentioned about starting to build out a team. How does somebody who runs so lean start?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of key elements to a privacy program. I think understanding the data you have, where you're doing with it, how you're collecting it, where it's being used, are you getting proper consent from the people you're taking that data from, are kind of some of the foundational pieces. But I think even more important to your risk is having this kind of a privacy incident response program, cybersecurity incident response program in place, And so having, even if it's, starts at a more basic level of like, okay, here is like the regulations and contracts I know I'm going to have to deal with, and like let me make sure I have that tracked, is kind of an easy piece. I think as you think about a lean team, if you're a legal team of one, then a lot of it is like recruiting some of the other players in your business, the other leaders, to be part of that incident response team, because it's going to be more than a one-person effort when this stuff happens. And so trying to deal with that on a solo basis is not going to be a recipe for success. So I think recruiting those privacy and cybersecurity champions within the organization is important.
Awesome. I know we're just about at 30 minutes in time here, but I think we have one more question that would be pretty relevant to just technology in general. But how has technology kind of helped shift, or maybe even just anything here? How has technology kind of helped the management of such issues in recent years?
So, like, maybe Heather, you want to talk about from the contract piece first?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, leveraging LinkSquare is leveraging, sorry, our powerful AI and technology really helps, especially like you mentioned, lean legal teams to have a more broad reach than they otherwise would. We hear often that it's an extremely manual process. That's historically how it has been done. And as your company continues to scale and as these obligations continue to increase, it's really impossible to do that as a one person, or even as a larger team. It's extremely time consuming, costly, and subject to error. So using a tool like LinkSquares or help from a company like BreachRx, it really allows you to be more efficient and effective in your efforts.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, Heather. And I think the future of work, really, I think for all companies, is how do we combine automation with expertise? And I think having legal tech, it can really help companies punch above their weight in a number of ways, and not have to have as big of a legal team for the amount of business you can accomplish, which is always of interest to the executive team. How can we do more with less?
Awesome. I think that is all of the questions. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar just in case there was anything that you missed. And as always, if there's anything that we can do, feel free to reach out to any one of us, anyone at LinkSquares, anyone at BreachRx. And thank you so much, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.